Both No Cold War Britain and the New South London Group have been set up with the express purpose of challenging the new Cold War and its dangerous consequences, and to provide space to hear a range of perspectives that unite around wanting a world based on anti-imperialism, anti-racism, social justice, and peace. The groups seek to build a movement in opposition to the new Cold War, and in the process are not only not scared to ruffle feathers, but take pride in it and encourage others to do the same. Indeed, I would argue we have a duty to oppose our Western regime's murderous actions. But it's also important to note that the intention is to complement and work alongside existing groups and organisations, both within Britain and beyond, towards the same shared goals. Just a point on the meeting itself. Initially, we intended for it to be a hybrid meeting, but we were loath to cross the picket line at where the venue was held. So in the end, went with the decision to run it online entirely, but we do hope to have some in-person meetings in the future. And speaking of the future, there are lots of future plans. So if you'd like to be kept up to date, we can use the email addresses provided via Eventbrite, but please ensure that you use the chat function to put your name and state that you give consent for your email to be used to be contacted for future events. The social media channels and website are also going to be put into the chat function, so please give them a follow to stay up to date. No Cold War has also put out various statements, which I'd encourage you all to sign, including, for example, one on ending the war in Ukraine and constructing a lasting peace. Now, please note that this is being recorded. I think a message came up moments ago, and will also be uploaded to No Cold War's YouTube channel. On this note, you do have the function to turn off your camera if you prefer, or we do also like to see people's faces, so feel free to leave it on too. Now, in terms of the format of the event, there will be speaker contributions followed by questions and answers. It's due to run for approximately an hour and a half, but we do have some time built in for leeway. So if the questions and contributions are flowing, we can go for an extra half an hour or so. You can ask questions following the contributions, but while people are speaking, please submit questions via the chat function, and we'll be able to use these to put to the panel. Also, feel free to suggest ideas for future speakers, ideas for events and activities. Always greatly appreciated. Now, before I introduce the first speaker, just a couple of very brief remarks. Now, firing a $70,000 missile from a $28 million drone, flying at a cost of $3,624 per hour to kill people in countries thousands of miles away that have neither attacked, threatened to attack, or posed any threat, is, I would suggest, the modus operandi of NATO powers abroad, from Libya to Afghanistan. But the cost, financial, but also human, moral, political, environmental, and cultural, is not considered in the mainstream calculus of war and power. But what else could money and resources be used for? Well, Andrew Basevich, who is an international relations scholar, and not, I might add, particularly radical, did sum it up well as follows. We live in a country where if you want to bomb somebody, there's remarkably little discussion about how much it might cost. But then you have a discussion about whether or not we can assist people who are suffering. Suddenly we become very cost conscious. Now, in this regard, it would take just 5% of the US military budget to end global hunger. And the US would still be higher than their nearest rival countries in terms of military spending. Yet while they spend nearly $1 trillion on military spending, people die from poverty and hunger and have to set up GoFundMes for medical care. Now, there are similar stories that can be seen in the UK. During a period where the national debt was doubled, £37 billion was given to a company for test and trace that didn't even work. And it's quite difficult to talk about this kind of capitalist corruption without doing a mini shout out to the classic case of the ship company, which some of you might be familiar with, that didn't even own any ships, yet was given a contract. But billions in arms also have been given to Ukraine, yet at the same time, there's no money for hospitals, teachers, to end homelessness, end food banks, and to help people heat their homes. Because we are told tough decisions need to be taken. Not, of course, so tough for shareholders of arms companies. Now, it's worth just mentioning or reminding ourselves, if we're not familiar, that through these cuts and austerity, which we're told are necessary, a new study by Glasgow Centre for Population Health has found that 300,000 people have died as a direct result. Now, it's in this context that we're putting on this event to discuss these topics. And just before I introduce our first speaker, I would just want to make the necessary point of the looming threat that sort of goes beyond this discussion in a way, which is the threat of nuclear confrontation. It's present, and there are those that casually talk about phrases such as limited tactical battlefield weapons without talking about the consequences of those weapons, which are devastating for humans and our habitat. And finally, just to say, because I always think it's impossible to talk about nuclear weapons without mentioning this example of how extreme the discourse has become within the UK context, that during election campaigns, both in 2017 and 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn was asked about whether he would, quote unquote, press the button and start a nuclear Armageddon, his response was, of course not, yet he was painted as the extreme person. Now, a nuclear war, and this is a quote, cannot be won and must never be fought. This was by Reagan and Gorbachev. But since the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and others have effectively withered away, the likelihood has also been increased. We want to argue in favor of diplomacy and negotiation, yet often in the mainstream, they're denigrated and even ridiculed. And I'll just finish by saying this, that arguing for negotiated peace is, in the so-called mainstream, considered an extreme position, yet arming Nazis and supporting nuclear war is not. I would suggest that this needs to be challenged forcefully, and we ought to be thinking about how best we can spend that money instead of on wars, but rather on people within our society. Now, firstly, we have with us today Andrew Feinstein. He's a former African National Congress MP, author, and campaigner. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much. You'd think that after a few years of this, I would have got slightly better at unmuting myself. Can you all hear me okay? Great. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. So I'll start off with the bad news, but follow it quite quickly with some good news, because it doesn't happen that often in investigating the global arms trade that there is good news, but today there is a little bit of it. So the bad news is that according to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which produces pretty much the gold standard on arms spending around the world, in the past 12 months, the world will for the first time spend over $2 trillion on defense. And defense should obviously be in inverted commas, because it's not defensive at all. It's deeply offensive, both in the literal and the metaphorical sense of the word. So that's the bad news. And I'm going to talk in a moment about the socioeconomic opportunity cost of that. But I also want to start off with some good news. And as some of you might have seen, and if you haven't, have a look at my Twitter feed and you can see the details there. But in answer to a parliamentary question, the British Minister for Defence Procurement, we could just call him the British Minister for Corruption, but that might be too honest a title for a senior politician to hold. So we'll keep going with his existing title. But in answer to a question in Parliament, he stated that Elbit Systems, the Israeli drone and other military materiel manufacturer, has lost almost £300 million of government contracts with the United Kingdom government. He has said that this is as part of what he calls a sovereignty drive by the British government with respect to defense procurement. Now, this would be vaguely believable if there weren't literally dozens and dozens of non-British defense companies providing the British Armed Forces with a wide variety of materiel and services. So why have Elbit been singled out? Well, I would like to suggest that it's as a consequence of the campaign by the Direct Action Group Palestine Action against Elbit Systems, which has really brought to prominence the role of this company in the brutal and illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. And I think that some of the information that has been brought forward by the Direct Action, that Palestine Action have been incredibly courageously engaged in, is embarrassing even to this British government. So I think we're seeing an example in which the risks to the state and to the armed forces have been significantly increased by the action of people whose objective is to get Elbit Systems out of the UK and who have forced the closure of 2 of Elbit Systems' 10 British factories. So an extremely good day to be talking about the opportunity costs of NATO's war, of NATO's wars, and in fact, the relationship of these wars to the cost of living crisis. So of course, the obvious socioeconomic opportunity cost is the $2 trillion that are being spent on our defense very kindly by our governments. It's $2 trillion that is not spent on healthcare, that is not spent on education, that is not spent of helping people in the midst of an appalling cost of living crisis that sees the use of food banks in what is the 6th or 7th wealthiest country in the world at its highest level since the end of the Second World War. And of course, not only does it mean less money to deal with the climate catastrophe that threatens us all, but in fact, the expenditure of that money is actually contributing to the climate crisis. It'll come as no surprise to anybody in this discussion that the Pentagon is the largest institutional polluter on the planet. The very worst type of fuel, aviation fuel, 25% of aviation fuel used in the world is used by military aircraft. So there are socioeconomic opportunity costs that are both material, but also that in turn intensify the various socioeconomic crises that we face. And as we know, an enormous amount of this expenditure is for extraordinarily expensive equipment that doesn't make us safer. If anything, it makes us less safe. And it does this in 2 primary ways. First of all, let's take the example of the F-35 jet fighter, the most expensive weapons system ever produced. That alone has so far cost the US taxpayer probably around $2 trillion for a jet that in February of this year, a US Inspector General for Defense concluded does not work. Now, there are two levels to how it doesn't work. The one is when he was president, Donald Trump, that extremely wise man, actually stated in a press conference that the F-35 was an invisible jet, and then went on to explain it's not just that the F-35 can't be seen on radar, etc. It is that when the F-35 is attacking, and he used the example, unsurprisingly, of a Chinese jet fighter, when the F-35 is attacking a Chinese jet fighter, the pilot of that Chinese jet fighter actually cannot see the F-35, even if it is a few meters away from the pilot. Now, this only reflected on Donald Trump's gargantuan stupidity, which he made clear to the world over and over again. Of course, it's not an invisible plane. It's a stealth aircraft, which means it is more difficult for certain types of radar to detect. But what the Inspector General for Defense meant, that it doesn't work, isn't that it doesn't work in Trump's terms of actually disappearing in some Harry Potter-esque type way, but that the brains of the jet fighter, what is often referred to as the combat suite, the most important technology that enables this jet to do all the stupendous things the military tells us it's supposed to do, is actually not fit for purpose, in the words of the Inspector General. And they will effectively have to start all over again in developing the brains of this, the world's most expensive ever weapons system. Now, the fact that the United States, the government of which has, incidentally, just ordered 365 more F-35 jets which don't work. There are also 26 other countries that have purchased the F-35, including the United Kingdom. So the fact that we are spending the billions of pounds that we are on this jet, even if one takes an incredibly narrow view of national security, which I don't, but some people do, even with that sort of perspective, spending this money on something that even the government that is responsible for producing it has determined does not work, can in no ways make any country safer, and in fact means that the country is not spending on other defense needs that it claims it might have, let alone on the other things that would actually engender far greater human security than defense spending does overall. Now, to continue to ensure that defense spending reaches record levels on almost an annual basis now, obviously, the main weapons producing countries of the world, and the United States of America produces 40% of all weapons that are produced in the world. The United Kingdom doesn't do too badly either. We are normally in the top 5 of weapons producers on the planet. These sorts of governments have to keep their defense budgets absurdly high. And why do they have to do this? Now, in the words of Lawrence Wilkerson, who, like Andrew Bacevich, who was mentioned in the introduction to tonight's discussion, describes himself as a conservative. Bacevich famously describes himself as a Catholic conservative. Lawrence Wilkerson served as Chief of Staff to General Colin Powell, both when he was chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and when he was Secretary of State. And Wilkerson describes a global national security elite comprising the most senior politicians, the most senior government officials, the most senior military and intelligence leaders, senior executives of the arms makers, as well as senior executives from the various intermediaries. And these are not just the sorts of characters one sees in Hollywood films like Lord of War, these sort of seedy players who seem to be more adventurers than anything else, selling weapons across Africa or other parts of the world. The real intermediaries on arms deals are the world's bankers, auditors, management consultants, and of course lawyers, all of whom profit hugely from their role in multi-billion-dollar arms deals. This is an industry that accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. 40%. And I'm happy to talk much more about that in the Q&A if you'd like me to. And what an enormous amount of that corruption does is it effectively oils the functioning of this global national security elite. And in so doing, effectively oils our politics in the following ways. When the United Kingdom, in the world's most corrupt commercial transaction in history, pays £6 billion of bribes to members of the Saudi royal family and assorted intermediaries, some of those bribes come back in what we call the feedback principle to the senior executives who are enabling this corruption in BAE systems, to the members of government who are allowing this corruption, to senior military leaders, intelligence leaders, and others who have played crucial roles in these deals. So on that particular deal known as the Al Yamamah deal, Sir Richard Evans received Mayfair apartments to the value of $6.5 million from one of the intermediaries on the deal. Let's look at Tony Blair, who since leaving office has made, in my estimation, a minimum of £110 million personally from his association with BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, and other British defense companies for whom he acted as marketer and salesperson in chief when he was Prime Minister. Sir Keir Starmer, and it's amazing how many of these people are knighted, actually, when one comes to think about it. Sir Keir Starmer is very happily treading the Tony Blair path. He has spent considerable amount of time over the past few weeks wining and dining with the senior executives of Britain's arms companies, attending sporting and other social and cultural events with them, and enmeshed in meetings with them, in which they will discuss Britain's defense and national security policy, because the senior executives of BAE Systems, for example, have access to all of the same national security meetings that the Secretary for Defense has access to. And these social circles in which they move are incredibly important in determining how the global arms trade operates. And I'm sure Starmer, having seen the example of Tony Blair, would have a very acute understanding of how much money there is to be made from these sorts of relationships once he leaves office, either as leader of the opposition or as a future prime minister, God help us. In the United States of America, the system of flows between companies and elected representatives for effectively then, once elected, giving contracts back to these companies is legal. And it's a system that I describe in my book, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, as a form of legalized bribery. And what makes it all possible is that these people operate with total impunity. I have taken literally hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of corruption in arms deals to prosecutors around the world. Not one of them has ever been successfully prosecuted. Now, NATO is a key and important part of this global national security elite. To call it a defensive alliance would even take George Orwell's notion of doublespeak into the realms of the absurd. It is an offensive alliance, both in military and material terms. So when the US dominated Western alliance decided to expand NATO, sadly in contravention of an undertaking that had been given to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they created what was called, very creatively, the Committee to Expand NATO. The person who chaired the Committee to Expand NATO was a senior vice president of the world's largest arms maker, Lockheed Martin. He traveled Eastern Europe, and his marketing pitch was as follows. If you accede to NATO membership, you will need to increase your defense capability by X billion dollars. If you spend those X billion dollars with my company, Lockheed Martin, I can guarantee you that the United States of America will support your accession to NATO. And that's exactly what happened. To give just one example, in the case of Poland, Lockheed Martin made $23 billion out of Lockheed Martin's military modernization program that enabled them to become members of NATO. Now, what NATO also does is it demands, and this is a demand that usually emanates from the White House, of ever-increasing percentages of GDP to be spent on defense. Donald Trump, in his infinite wisdom, came up with a figure of 3%. He had no justification for that figure. It was just larger than the US's previous call, which had been 2%. So NATO members are all striving to spend 3% of GDP on defense. It is this very expansion of NATO that has been one of the partial causes of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is in no way to excuse Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, but undertakings given by American and other Western diplomats to Russia have been violated. But what makes it even worse is the fact that while our leaders have been stressing the importance of providing the Ukraine with weapons to defend themselves, the very companies who our governments promote have continued to profiteer from the weapons they sell to Ukraine, and that are being subsidized by British, American, and other Western taxpayers. The premiums being demanded in the Ukraine for weaponry, from small and light weapons all the way to the most sophisticated, largest equipment that is being sold into the conflict, sometimes are as much as 30%. So while some people are saying, thank goodness for NATO, thank goodness for our arms-making companies, those companies find it impossible not to behave as war profiteers, even in a situation like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And what the conflict has done in turn has enabled politicians in every so-called Western state to commit to massive increases in defense spending. So you get a sense of how this circle of profitability works in reality and who benefits from it. Germany have announced the intention of increasing defense spending by 100 billion euros from already high levels.
Hi, Andrew, just to say, we'll go 5 more minutes.
Sure, I'll actually not take all 5 of them.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah.
I want to conclude by giving you one example of the socioeconomic costs of warfare, the arms trade that it has spawned, and the militarism that underpins it. In my own country, in South Africa, when I was serving as an ANC member of parliament and running something called the Public Accounts Committee, the main financial oversight committee, we received a report from our Auditor General of a $10 billion arms deal that our new democratic government, led by the ANC, had undertaken in 1998, 1999, for weaponry that we didn't need, that we have barely used in the over 20 years since then. Why did we buy this weaponry? Because a minimum of $350 million of bribes were paid to senior ANC politicians, officials, to the executives of our arms company, to military leaders, to officials in our defense force, and to the ANC itself. This was the point at which, according to the editor of the leading political weekly in South Africa, that the ANC lost its moral compass. But more importantly, at the same time that we were spending this $10 billion, our then president informed us that we did not have the fiscal resources to provide antiretroviral medication to the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS. As a consequence of that political choice, according to a fairly conservative study undertaken at Harvard University, over the following 5 years, 365,000 South Africans died. 32,000 babies a year, every year for those 5 years, were born HIV positive because their parents and the government could not afford to provide mother-to-child transmission treatment. But we could afford to spend $10 billion on jet fighters provided by BAE Systems, paying £115 million, with constant visits and support from then Prime Minister Tony Blair and a certain Prince Andrew. These people were too poor to buy life. And the money that should have been saving their lives was spent on equipment manufactured to take even more lives. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm sure you'll all agree that Andrew presented that with characteristic, wide-ranging and penetrating insights, and always brings narrative power to dense information and statistics, and really brings home the human consequences. And personally, I always learn so much whenever I hear Andrew speak, just picking out a few of those statistics. I mean, the F-35 not only doesn't work, costs nearly 2 trillion, and they, as it was described, opportunity costs that could be spent on schools, hospitals, infrastructure. And this was another standout: 25% of jet fuel used globally is used by military aircraft, which again really brings home the environmental aspect of the issue. And one which I think for a lot of British people of anti-war persuasion, Blair making over £100 million since leaving office, is somewhat perverse and repugnant really when you think of it in terms of the number of Iraqis killed. It works out to £100 per Iraqi killed, which is a sobering thought. And really what I suppose I'd recommend to everyone is, if you haven't already seen the documentary Shadow World or bought the book Shadow World, I'd strongly recommend them all. pop them in the chat in a moment. Now, next up, we're very pleased to be welcoming Rashida Islam, anti-racist and anti-war activist from Stop the War Calderdale. Over to you, Rashida.
Thanks, Sequoia, and thanks to NOCOR to inviting me to speak. So I'm going to try and keep this short as possible. Plus, I also have to leave quite soon. So I'm going to basically just race through my speech. So ultimately, a few weeks ago, there was a missile strike in Poland where Russia was incorrectly blamed, and it transpires actually Ukraine was the real culprit. And this is a particularly dangerous thing to do, as it did lead to an increase in global tensions. It poses particularly hard questions for NATO powers. Why are you backing such a power when it blatantly lies about things that it's caused? And also, because of this misinformation tactic, it could and has led to catastrophe for civilians, as we've seen prior with Iraq, Libya, and Yugoslavia. And ultimately, what needs to come out of this war is a ceasefire. We need a diplomatic resolution, but unfortunately, Western powers such as the UK and the United States are applying the boot on Zelensky's neck. We had reports that pertain to the previous Prime Minister. It's hard to keep track. Boris Johnson and the current US President Biden pressuring Zelensky to refuse to negotiate with Russia. And this is bad, because ultimately a nuclear war leads to a catastrophic number of deaths that we absolutely should be trying to avoid. And also this links to the theme of tonight's event is obviously the cost of living crisis. And so how does war affect that? Well, through the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. In particular, I'll start off with the impact of sanctions on the global south. So Russia, is a major exporter of essential products such as fertilizer and wheat, but because these exports have been severely restricted, in particular food, fertilizer and fuel, this has caused global prices to surge. And since the war has began, wheat prices have increased by 21%, and some fertilizers have increased by 40%. And the painful impact of this shock is being felt by people around the world, but most sharply in the global south. You had previously United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres remarking that in this world, the developing countries are getting pummeled. And according to the UN, 45 African and least developed countries import at least a third of their wheat from Russia or Ukraine, and 18 of those countries import at least 50%. Other countries include Egypt, Turkey, Kenya, and Lebanon, and even Brazil. So countries of the global south are already facing severe price shocks and shortages, which affects their consumption or detrimentally affects their consumption and production. It's also having a negative impact on the people of Europe, but it's just worth kind of outlining, just exactly what the cost of living means in the UK. So earlier this year, the Centre for Economics and Business Research consultancy said the prospect of living standards are taking the biggest hit since records began in 1955. As a result of higher commodity prices, they estimate that disposable incomes will fall in 2022 by just under 5%, with a further fall of 1.4% next year. So what that amounts to, so the forecasted fall in living standards this year is an estimated £71 billion, which amounts to just over £2,500 per household. In addition, it should be clear that the actual effect on prices in Europe is directly, so that the negative impact is directly effect of the sanctions that Britain and the EU have imposed on Russia. As a result, Europeans are now buying much more expensive gas from countries. They're re-exporting Russian energy, at a higher price, or which are hugely more expensive than US's liquid natural gas. And the shortages, they didn't have to be there, but they are a self-inflicted consequence of Western sanctions. And Western leaders' attempts to deflect responsibility for this crisis can be highlighted by, by two key facts, which were that the rise in global prices, were taking place before the war in Ukraine, or almost 2 years before, and like nearly all financial and physical commodities, US house prices actually began to surge 2 years ago, where which is 2 years before the Ukraine war started in February. So it's impossible to to put that blame on Russia and Ukraine, when in reality it's the actions and the choices of the governments in Western nations that have led to the current crisis that we're all suffering from. And cost of living is thanks to inflation. So Britain is the G7 country with the greatest negative combination of economic slump and inflation, where and this is, against this is as a disastrous economic backdrop against which NATO countries plan to significantly increase their military spending when they really should be investing more in their public services, including our NHS, which according to, I can't remember which report it was, but in Europe we have the worst health service across the continent. Since organising the coup in Kiev in 2014, NATO members' military spending is expected to increase by $140 billion, and it's set to increase more, what with the US committing more military spending. And it's these US humanitarian concerns regarding Ukraine ring hollow, given its continuous funding of the Saudi bombing of Yemen and Israel's brutal colonial occupation of Palestine. We've still yet to see any justice for the murder of Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Israel refuses to cooperate with FBI inquiries regarding that. And also the United States has given Israel a total of $146 billion in bilateral assistance and missile defense funding throughout 2020. In 2022, the total number of UK exports to Israel amounted to £3 billion, which was an increase of 13.7% in comparison to the previous year. And so ultimately, where is this proxy war with Russia headed? Where is this increase in military spending headed? It's ultimately the end goal of this is to have a confrontation with China. The United States lost in terms of economic competition to developing countries across the world. According to the IMF, the US has been overtaken by countries like by China in terms of being the world's largest economy. But that being said, the US does maintain it does remain the world's global military superpower. Therefore, its military expenditure will match that capability, and it's that military expenditure is actually larger than the next 9 highest spending countries combined. So ultimately what they're trying to do is seeking to maintain unipolar global dominance, with being flagged by its allies across the G7 and NATO. And so therefore the US is increasingly substituting peaceful economic competition with military force. And ultimately what we need to do, the way, as I said earlier, is that we have to pressure our politicians at home, either in the UK, US, across Europe, to withdraw military financial aid and push for peace. So recently, US top military officer General Mark Milley, he actually split from the White House in calling for diplomacy with Russia in order to end the Ukraine war. And we should absolutely be supporting those initiatives. Campaigns like Stop the War have been highlighting the link between the sanctions imposed on Russia and the cost of living crisis. And also the campaigns like CND they've waged a campaign such as Wages Not Weapons, which is, instead of wasting money in weapons, the government must instead address the frightening cost of living crisis facing millions of us this winter. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss, she repledged to spend 3% of Britain's GDP on defence, which is an increase from 2%. This is money for war, when the government should be instead making sure people could eat and heat their homes over the coming months. The country also needs investment in our NHS. We need to build more homes, a better transport system, and an answer to the energy crisis, as well as tackling the harrowing impacts of climate change. So we absolutely should be working to reverse this disgraceful increase in military spending. And yeah, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rashida. That was a brilliant tour de force, covering lots in a short period. I think it seems like you challenge yourself and see how much information you can get in with a short period of time, and it was effectively done. And of course brought up some very important points in relation to the impact of sanctions on Russia, as some have described, effectively sanctioning ourselves. But also it's important to have highlighted the impact on the global south, in that exports from Russia being restricted, namely wheat, fertilizer, etc., having a devastating effect on people, while with a straight face, apparently, Western leaders also talk about human rights and humanitarianism. And of course, the cost of living standards falling, more expensive for gas, etc. It's important to highlight those things, and also providing the specific context within Ukraine in relation to the US helping orchestrate the 2014 coup and what that has helped to result in. And also giving a sort of strategic bigger picture in mentioning the end goal, of course, also including China, which Rishi Sunak's recent remarks also allude to in an act of what only reasonably described as self-harm. And ultimately, thanks, Rashida, for reminding us our governments should be paying for people, not for wars and shareholder profits. Now, lastly, in fact, just before I bring in Fiona, just remind people, please feel free to put in questions in the chat. We will also be taking them after Fiona has finished her contribution. So next up, we've got Fiona Edwards of No Cold War International and No Cold War Britain Steering Committee, and who also writes on Latin America. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Sequoia, and thanks very much to the organisers of this evening's event, which I think is really important and timely. And also thank you very much to the other speakers. Really enjoyed both of your contributions. Just to go back to the title of the meeting, NATO war is indeed making us poorer, but it's also making humanity a lot less safe as well. And I wanted to start by asking the question, what is NATO? The Western media like to paint a picture of NATO as a defensive, peace-loving alliance which exists to defend human rights and democracy. And I'm sure people listening tonight know that this couldn't be further from the truth. NATO is a tool of US foreign policy. It's an expansionist war machine, an aggressive military alliance, and it exists to advance the geopolitical interests of Washington. We could ask the people of Libya what they think of NATO, because NATO's war against Libya in 2011 saw open-air slave markets reappear in a nation that once boasted Africa's highest human development index. That is what NATO is. So if NATO is a tool of US foreign policy, what exactly is the US's foreign policy focus? I think that's the key question. Last year, the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, ended with the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan. This was a 20-year project, a 20-year US project, which brought death, destruction, chaos, and terrorism to the Middle East and North Africa. The United States, Britain, and other Western allies led these wars on Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, causing the deaths of millions of people. So after causing this human rights catastrophe, the US unfortunately hasn't become more peace-loving, but instead it's focusing on new targets. And unfortunately, the stakes are even bigger today, and the threats that the US foreign policy poses to humanity are even greater than the catastrophe of the past 20-year war on terror. So why is that? Well, the biggest issue facing the world today is that the United States is utterly determined to stop the rise of China. The entire political establishment in the United States, both the Democrats and the Republicans, are agreed that the rise of China poses an existential threat to the United States project of global dominance. And so the US is today waging a war, at the present time, a Cold War against China, but we should be clear that this carries the very serious risk of breaking out into hot war. And the threat that this poses to humanity shouldn't be underestimated. Despite the fact that China's economy is already larger than the US's, it's the case that the United States is still the most powerful country in the world. It's an economic superpower, and it is the most formidable military force on the planet. So the United States spends more every year on the military than the next 10 countries combined, which includes, by the way, China and Russia. It's the United States that has 800 military bases around the globe targeting against China and Russia, and no other country in the world remotely has such a chain of military bases. And I think we need to be clear about some of the discussions that are taking place amongst the upper echelons of the US foreign policy circles, because they're frankly terrifying. It includes explicit talking up of the possibility of hot war with China, and even the prospect of the United States using nuclear weapons in such a conflict. So I just want to quote the head of US Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, from January 2001, where he said, "There is a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons, and that the US must shift its principal assumption from nuclear employment is not possible to nuclear employment is very possible, and act to meet and deter that reality." So that's the discussion that's happening at the top of the US foreign policy establishment. And we should remember that the only country in the world to have used atomic weapons to date is the United States, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and with truly devastating consequences. As we've discussed tonight, this new Cold War has already turned hot. It's turned hot in Ukraine. We should be clear that the war in Ukraine is a NATO proxy war against Russia. The explicit goal of this war was spelled out by the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin when he said, the goal is weakening Russia. For the United States, a weakened Russia is important because it will improve the balance of forces internationally, the US attacks on China. So this is totally linked to the overall goal of stopping the rise of China. And it's crucial to understand that the roots of the conflict, roots of the current conflict in Ukraine, it's crucial to understand it's coming from US intervention. So contrary to the Western media claims, it is not the case that Russia's military intervention from February of this year was, quote, unprovoked. It was in fact deliberately provoked by the United States' aggressive foreign policy, which has seen a hostile nuclear alliance led by Washington, i.e. NATO, expand right up to Russia's border over the course of decades, deliberately and knowingly breaking the promises that were made in the early 1990s that NATO would not expand an inch eastwards of Berlin. So the threat of Ukraine joining NATO is very clear. It would enable the United States to station its nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory within a few minutes flight time of Moscow. In the face of such a threat, Russia has been clear in stating that Ukraine joining NATO is a red line that it would not permit the United States to cross. And I think it's important we think about the reverse for a second. Would the US tolerate Russian nuclear weapons to be stationed on its border? I really don't think so. So this current conflict in Ukraine didn't begin this year, as is projected in the media, but it did begin in 2014 when Washington orchestrated a far-right coup, which removed the democratically elected president of Ukraine and brought an end to Ukrainian neutrality, and instead installed a pro-US regime in Kiev that made joining NATO a key priority. This intervention from the United States triggered a civil war in Ukraine, in which the United States and other NATO countries provided military aid and training, including the British government, to the Kiev regime, to far-right militias, which assaulted the Russian population in the Donbass. So without NATO expansion, without the US coup in Ukraine, without an 8-year Western-backed civil war targeting the Russian population in the east of Ukraine, there would be no war in Ukraine today. This tragedy was made in Washington. And it's the Ukrainian people that are paying a very high price, a horrific price, with tens of thousands killed and injured. And a lot of people have commented that the West is essentially treating the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder in their geopolitical assault on Russia. And this is totally avoidable. This was totally avoidable. The key to peace in Ukraine is clear. It's about no to NATO and yes to protecting the rights of national minorities. But the United States and Britain are just determined to wreck any move towards negotiations and a political settlement. And they would prefer to prolong the war in Ukraine because that is what's going to achieve the US's geostrategic objective of weakening Russia. So I think we have to say no to continued escalation of this war by NATO, and yes to a negotiated peace that can end the conflict and the suffering as soon as possible. Britain and Europe are also paying a heavy economic price for this war, as some of the other speakers touched on. The US, of course, has been sending tens of billions of dollars worth of military aid to Ukraine and demanding that its NATO allies in Europe follow its lead. And of course, Britain has enthusiastically responded to this call by sending billions in military aid this year, and Prime Minister Sunak has pledged to continue that for the year ahead. And at the same time, the US continues to push NATO countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on the military, which Britain does. And these inflated military budgets, which aren't, to defend NATO, but are offensive to attack other countries, these are draining vital resources which should be used to tackle the cost of living crisis and to tackle the common and urgent threats and problems facing humanity, like climate change, like tackling pandemics, and many other things too. Also, the sanctions on Russia being imposed by Europe, Britain, are impacting very negatively. These are an act of self-harm, and they're benefiting the United States. So it's particularly harming Europe's economy in that it's having to replace cheaper supplies of energy from Russia with more expensive fuels, including the very costly liquefied natural gas from the United States. So overall, the population of Europe is having to pay a huge price for this US proxy war in Ukraine. Worryingly, I just want to say very worryingly, the United States isn't content with waging an aggressive proxy war against one nuclear armed state, Russia, but is seemingly determined to ratchet up this aggression against China at the same time, another nuclear armed state. So just as the United States deliberately crossed Russia's red line with NATO expansion, Washington is taking steps to erode the United States' support for the One China principle through provocative statements and actions on the issue of Taiwan, which is part of China. And this is very understandably China's red line. It's a question of China's sovereignty. So you've got the United States, a situation where the United States is regularly sending warships to roam around the South China Sea. And last year, in a gesture of support for this aggression of the United States against Beijing, we had Britain, Germany, and France all sending warships into this region. Do we see Chinese warships roaming around the coast of the California or Cornwall? I don't think so. So the US is consciously building up military alliances in Asia against China. So you've got the new alliances like AUKUS, which Britain is a part of, with Australia and the United States, and older ones like NATO, which is now setting its sights on China. And there's live discussion taking place within NATO on that at the moment. So all of that, in terms of the topic of today's meeting, all of this begs the question, why is the British government spending billions of pounds to send weapons to Ukraine on an overinflated military budget and on sending an aircraft carrier to the South China Sea, but is refusing to give nurses a well overdue pay rise, or a pay rise to all the other workers in Britain suffering from real term pay cuts amid soaring inflation, soaring energy prices, and deepening cuts to public services. At the same time, the United States' economic warfare against China is also stepping up. As was discussed, the US's relative economic decline vis-a-vis China has accelerated during the pandemic. The latest data reveals China's economy grew 3 times as fast as the US between the end of 2019 and today. And China's economy is already 18% larger than the US economy. Washington regard this as intolerable. It needs to be stopped, but they've got no plan to compete with China to boost its own economic growth in the United States, but instead they want to focus on attempting to slow down the Chinese economy through Cold War attacks. And with regards to Britain, obviously, the British government's going along with all of this, but China is the world's most dynamic economy. And if we were pursuing mutually beneficial relations, that would be beneficial to the people of Britain. But instead, the British government is pursuing an anti-China policy. This is damaging Britain's economy further by threatening trade, investment, jobs, access to more efficient technology, educational opportunities, and therefore is making the British people even worse off. So just wanted to say, the enemy of ordinary people in the United States, Britain, and Europe is not Russia or China, it's the US war machine, and it's making us poorer and less safe. And I just wanted to end with one, just to say, I think we need to be fighting for higher wages at home and against sending weapons into war zones abroad. And I think amidst a really big strike wave that's taking place in Britain at the moment and growing, I think we need to be taking this message to the picket lines across the country. Thank you very much. Solidarity.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Fiona. As fiery and as informative as ever, essential information and powerful warning. I mean, to start with, what is NATO? It is, and I'm glad both you and Andrew brought that up. It's a self-proclaimed defensive alliance. It is one of the more amusing, or rather tragicomic phrases to describe oneself when your activities are engaged in the polar opposite. And thank you also for mentioning Libya. I think it's an important example of a country that had the highest standards of living in Africa, and then, as you described, ended up having open air slave markets and sectarian death squads running parts of the country. And at the same time, we often hear people describe African countries pejoratively as despotic failed states, and who is to blame in this instance, and who created those circumstances. And always essential to remind people of how many bases, because it's literally never mentioned in mainstream news coverage of the US and its military actions, that it has a widespread network of bases that dominate much of the world. And indeed, it's the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons, despite describing certain countries such as North Korea and Iran as nuclear threats. And just to quickly pick up on one of the points that Fiona mentioned, which I think is important, the distinction between provocation versus justification. Now, people may be against Russia's intervention, some people may be for it, but the important point here is, and just to use a quick analogy, if you had someone who, let's say, was poking someone in the eye, and they were doing it for years, and the person kept warning them, if you keep doing that, eventually I'm going to attack you. It wouldn't necessarily mean their reaction is justified, but it certainly isn't unprovoked. And I think it's important to draw that distinction. And finally, well, a couple more things I just wanted to pick up on. I think it makes me smile. It's more of a wry smile than anything else when I hear people, usually in the US or the Western nations, describe China's activities in, and just listen to this carefully, in the South China Sea as threatening and aggressive to Western nations. You can't write these things, honestly, utterly ridiculous. And again, as Fiona mentioned, what would the US do if things were the other way around? And thank you for rounding things off well with the call to fight for higher wages at home and against wars abroad. I've picked up on a few questions that have been put in the chat so far. We'll begin with, I think it was John, who's put a couple of questions in, which we'll put to both our speakers. What has to be done to stop the US continuing to create chaos in Europe? And secondly, can Asia prevent the US creating the same type of chaos as it has in Europe? And if we could firstly turn to Andrew for some insight, and then Fiona. And feel free to comment on anything else as well.
You know, what I would like to say, but and I don't want it to come across as glib, but what it would take is for the UK and Europe to develop a backbone. I mean, it astonishes me, and I say this as someone who lives in the United Kingdom, but I still regard myself as something of an outsider. I don't hold British citizenship or a British passport, even though I've been here for 20 odd years. How so many in the United Kingdom accept it being the poodle of the United States is something that honestly astonishes me. The only difference in the analogy being that the United States doesn't pick up the poodle's turds, because that would almost be as though the United States followed international law. And of course it doesn't. It sees itself as above international law and sees international law as problematic unless it suits the interests of the United States. I mean, I think what it would take to be more serious and more honest is fundamental changes to the nature and structure of our politics and economics. I think our political systems and our economies have failed. And they have failed the vast majority of people in both the global north, but more particularly the global south. And I think what we are seeing now is that even the sort of material benefits of our political economic order are starting to dissipate because the tiny elite at the top have decided they want far more, and that far more has to be taken from ordinary people. And we live in an extraordinary situation where it feels to me as if ordinary people on the streets of Britain, on the streets of Europe, on the streets of the United States of America are effectively being hit over the head by their governments. And while they're comatose, those same governments are allowing the corporations to take whatever we have. And this is completely unsustainable. It's unsustainable economically, but even more, it's unsustainable politically. And again, to come back to Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, retired, which is his full title. When I asked him a similar question when we were making the Shadow World film, his response was, sadly, it's going to take blood on the streets. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, and again reiterating that he sees himself as a conservative, he was still at that point a card-carrying member of the Republican Party. We require revolution. And that's the only thing that's going to change the role of the United States in Europe and elsewhere in the world, is if we allow our political orders to continue as they are, in my opinion.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Fiona?
Thanks, Sequoia. Yeah, well, heavy questions to answer, but I mean, I think the key issue that's just been said is Europe having an independent foreign policy from the United States and not just going along with what the US wants. And there is a struggle taking place in Europe, but the US agenda has been advancing, and essentially economic interests, which are very clear, trading with China. Very beneficial to European economies. We can see with the sanctions against Russia, this is hurting the populations of Europe. But the US is pushing a very strong political agenda, political and ideological agenda against Russia and China. So I think the key issue is it's not in the interests of anyone in Europe to do this. And so I think that's the key question: is can we develop an independent foreign policy? I think the balance of forces in Europe is a lot worse than in other places across the world. I mean, through the experience of being involved in no Cold War internationally, and in places like Latin America, you've got former presidents and current presidents against the Cold War. Like in Brazil, I don't know if people saw the victory speech of Lula, but he declared in his speech, we don't want a Cold War. Whereas, if you look at the most recent comments by the Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak, it's quite the opposite. I know that they do rhetorically say, oh, we're not having a Cold War, but the content of everything they're putting forward is exactly a Cold War. And I think that the situation in Asia is much better balance of forces against the US aggression. So I would hope that what wins out in Asia is countries continuing their beneficial relations with China, and don't sort of get taken in by these US attempts to divide and rule, essentially. But it's very interesting to see that where the United States is starting from is countries like Britain and Australia with itself to intervene into Asia. So that shows a dynamic there in terms of the Western alliances trying to intervene into Asia. So it's very interesting that part of the AUKUS agreement, you didn't have countries like South Korea sign up to it. So I think that shows that the US has made less progress in Asia than it has in Europe.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot, Fiona. And Andrew, Got a few more questions. I'm going to pair these because they're both quite short. One person's asked, can one of the speakers explain the Minsk agreement? I don't expect either to be necessarily experts, but if anyone can just give at least a bit of insight or overview would be helpful. And secondly, which country has benefited most from military conflict and escalation in Ukraine? And if it's okay, I'll go with the same order, Andrew, if you're good to go.
Fiona, do you feel able to cover the Minsk agreement?
Not with any particular level of authority than you probably, but
that's what worries me, is that I am loath to speak about something that I know about only very superficially. So let me talk to the issue of which country has benefited. Now, the obvious beneficiary of the situation has been the United States of America, in my opinion. And that's for two reasons. Both geopolitically, as Fiona said earlier, you know, if the objective is to weaken Russia, which it clearly is, America would probably perceive that it has done that to at least some extent. And whether that is correct or not is, of course, a moot point, because we shouldn't forget one other thing either. And that is, before the dreadful human suffering that is always a consequence of war and conflict, the first victim of any war is always truth. And it is extraordinarily difficult, while the conflict is ongoing, to actually get a fairly accurate picture of what is going on, who is being weakened and who is being strengthened, what the geopolitical consequences of that conflict are. But I think the US at this point would probably perceive that Russia, and Putin in particular, has been weakened by the conflict. But the other obvious way in which the United States is such an overwhelming winner in this conflict is producing 40% of the world's weaponry means that its arms makers and all of those who feed from the trough of those arms makers have benefited hugely materially. And that is probably of more concern to them than anything else. And I think we forget the economic imperatives of conflict at our peril. And it's the one thing I've tried to do in around 20 years of doing this investigative work, is to show how economics, both at a global level, at a national level, and at a personal level, plays such an important role in driving the arms trade and in driving our propensity to conflict. And the one thing that always reminds me of this is that the United States of America has more government employees, people employed by the US government and its private contractors, I should say, running and maintaining one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. The United States today has 12 aircraft carriers under commission. Now that's just one weapon system. So the interest in diplomacy is non-existent. Everything that the United States of America and its poodle-like allies do is perceived through what C. Wright Mills described as a military mindset. In other words, the lens of militarism pervades their understanding of the world in every possible facet. And therefore, any ongoing conflict in which the US is engaged directly or indirectly, benefits what Wilkerson described as the global national security elite.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Lots of flesh to the bones of that point and question there. Fiona, would you like to comment on either of them?
Well, very briefly, I mean, I think the United States has advanced politically in Europe in terms of the capitulation of European countries. And then I think this aggression at the same time has backfired a lot in the global south. And so I think there's two different trends in the world where, you know, a lot of countries in the global south, you know, are feeling the effects of the economic crisis, do understand that this is being caused by NATO aggression. I mean, I think Evo Morales, former president of Bolivia, said, you know, the key issue of the day today, and this was earlier this year, is we need a campaign against NATO. And I think, you know, the clarity that you have from progressive forces in places like Latin America and Asia about the role of NATO, compared, unfortunately, to the ideological decay of some of the progressive forces and left in Britain and Europe, is very, very stark. There's a very different political line of left forces in the global north versus the global south. But I mean, I think the key thing is, I mean, it's not in the interest of majority of humanity. It's in the interest of the people that are benefiting are a tiny elite in the US. And I think even, you know, capitalist interests in Europe are not necessarily benefiting from this situation economically, but I think this is about, you know, US foreign policy. And I mean, I think some of the discussion in the chat, you know, it's startling how fast Europe collapsed into capitulating over this question.
Thanks, Fiona. We've had a comment and a question. I'm going to slightly abuse my position as chair to tack on a question to a comment. Someone has said, I believe that the media plays a huge part in keeping the populace ignorant of the truth. And when the truth is exposed, as it was by Julian Assange, the truth teller is jailed and tortured. So on the back of that, there was recent leaked Western intel documents which discussed the sort of process of intellectual and psychological manipulation using heuristic schemata. Not to get too technical, there was just one quote that I took from it. We are in the business, and I won't do an American accent because it was American, but we're in the business of critical infrastructure, none more so than cognitive infrastructure, which these intel agencies want to be able to control so that we associate, think, feel, and behave in ways conducive to their goals. Now, on the back of that, I also want to mention some recent research which looked at views of China and Russia, and it found that countries that were so-called liberal democracies had views that were 75% negative against China and 87% against Russia. And they constituted a far smaller proportion of the global population, whereas the rest of the world, which in this context constituted 6.3 billion of the population, had 70% of them had a positive view of China and 66% positive view of Russia. So the question, that was slightly long-winded, but I just want to preface it. What role does propaganda play in justifying and normalizing war and the arms industry? And then there's another question that someone's put about Taiwan, but I'll come back to that one. So Andrew, if you could go with that one first, and then I'll come over to Fiona again. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, just sorry, I also noticed a question about some people asking, what are the Minsk agreements? So let's just spend 30 seconds on that. This was a series of agreements in which there was an attempt by, I mean, it was really from the European side led by France and Germany to try and bring an end to the conflict in the Donbass region between the Ukraine and between those in the region who were wanting far closer relationships with Russia. I think it's pretty clear that while at one point it looked as though there were definitely diplomatic ways to resolve this issue, with the sort of rising tensions and the Russia-Ukraine conflict that we've seen this year, I think it would be very fair to call the Minsk agreements a failure, but they were an attempt to reach some sort of diplomatic solution to the issues in that disputed region. Just so, because, sorry, there were a couple of people who said, well, what are the Minsk agreements? So I hope that gives you some sense of what they were. Then very quickly on the role of the media, I mean, I think that when it comes to issues of defense and national security, the media has played a pitiful role for certainly as long as I can remember, and continues to. I think we have seen in recent times, and I'm saying probably the last decade or so, we've seen an even further deterioration in the quality of the media, in the lack of commitment to any sort of meaningful investigative work by what we often refer to as the mainstream media. And I think that it plays an incredibly important role in the sort of militarism that dominates the world and the sort of underpinnings of conflict, including the current conflict. And, you know, I said in reply to the last question that the first victim of war is truth. And nowhere is this better reflected than in the nature of our media in the lead up to and during conflict, where there is this notion that every conflict is Manichean in nature. In other words, it is absolutely clear that there is good and evil, and that's it. And their role is effectively to act as public relation arms of the state to support the Manichean approach of the state to any particular conflict. And I find it enormously frustrating and enormously difficult to try and make critical comment on the sorts of issues that I work on at times like this because of the nature of our media. And the only thing that I can say in regard to that, to not make it all sound completely hopeless, is I would strongly advise extreme cynicism when engaging with the mainstream media at any level whatsoever on these issues. And I would strongly endorse some very important fact-based alternative media that is out there and that is extremely valuable. Somebody has put in the comments, I've just seen something about the Morning Star. The Morning Star is one of the few papers that actually writes from a more critical perspective on these issues. But I would also want to mention, very importantly, and I have a vested interest here in that I serve on their board, is Declassified UK, who I think do some incredible investigative work on British foreign policy, the role of Britain in the world, British defense and intelligence policy, and the real state of Britain's democracy. So if you haven't come across Declassified UK before, please do look at their stuff. It is invaluable in times of conflict and also in those brief pauses between conflict that we experience in the world.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I would also second that call to check out Declassified and, of course, Morning Star. Fiona.
Well, I agree. Yeah, I agree with what's been said, and I think you know, it's getting worse and worse by the day, really. But I mean, I think the features I've noticed about the mainstream media coverage of this war are not just the kind of bombarding of one narrative on repeat, but the shutting down of any alternative view at all. You can't even get in the opinion pages of The Guardian or The Independent. There's no alternative view put forward. Not only that, alternative views are witch hunted. So if you've got some, you know, activists or independent journalists on Twitter and social media, you've actually had hit pieces from The Guardian attacking them, from the New Statesman attacking them. You know, it's not just don't advertise the views, it's go and attack them. And this is when people say NATO is an expansionist organization, NATO is aggressive. This is being witch hunted by journalists in The Guardian. So and there's no debate, because you're not allowed to put those views in The Guardian. So it's very, very one-sided. But I have noticed that there are voices, even in the West, where I think the debate is very difficult, and people are being, threatened in this, in this really quite McCarthyist atmosphere. People are speaking out, and when you consider, the points that have been made around, well, actually, outside of Europe, outside of the United States, the world looks a lot more different, and there isn't the same approach in terms of how NATO is seen in the global South, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Those voices just aren't put forward. They're demonized. So we can feel very much in a minority and under attack from putting out what I would say is the truth, that NATO is expansionist, NATO is aggressive. But I think we do have to remember that internationally we're not complete, we're not in a tiny minority, but potentially in a significant majority, actually. But that just isn't reflected in the mainstream media. But you have to ask the question, why are they going to such lengths to do this then? Because they really want to control the narrative. They really want to get as much public support behind this, because the consequences are very bad for ordinary people. We are paying more for our energy. We are losing investment and jobs because of these poorer relations we're going to get with China. We're having more expensive telecommunications and stuff. So they have to constantly whip it up and create, a kind of enemy to justify all these budgets of military spending, etc. So I think, they're very determined to shut down a real debate and discussion. I think that's one of the key goals of No Cold War, is to actually open up a discussion in a very sort of difficult environment, definitely in the global north. But like I say, in the global south, you've got governments and presidents from both the left and the right that are clearly against the Cold War. So I think we have to sort of see ourselves as part of an international movement, because it's very depressing if you just think it is only what's happening in the global north, because there has been a lot of capitulation, even by progressive forces, to this US agenda at this present time.
Could I just add one other thing that we should have mentioned, which I think somebody has mentioned in the chat? And that is, when we think of the media and we see the sort of criticism from our own government about other countries where there supposedly isn't a free media, et cetera, we obviously cannot have this discussion without mentioning Julian Assange and without mentioning whistleblowers who have in recent years, despite the awfulness of the mainstream media, who have been incredibly courageous in particularly bringing out national security and defense information, bringing it into the public domain. And of course, and this won't be news to anybody here, but in Julian Assange, we have the situation where the person who was responsible, with his very courageous sources, of revealing war crimes committed by the United States of America is now being treated as the worst possible criminal. And if his extradition goes ahead, will spend the rest of his life in jail if there isn't an attempt to execute him. While all of those, the political decision makers, the military leaders, the people who actually engaged in torture and pulled the triggers, have never faced a court of law for their war crimes, for their torture, for their crimes against humanity. And if anything is a reflection of the state of the world in which we live, it is the case of Julian Assange and those who he revealed as perpetrators.
Thank you both. Completely, totally agree with that. And I think it's outrageous, frankly, that people are banned, views are banned, and as was mentioned, Assange is hopefully not, but looks like he's going to be extradited, whilst at the same time, those who have committed heinous crimes, and I'm reminded actually that Rumsfeld went to his deathbed, and this is someone who, and we're not just talking about chain of command type responsibility, he personally wrote on a memo that has since been released in relation to torture in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, he said increase and worsen the methods. So it's quite harrowing to talk about the specific methods, so I won't go into it. But the fact that he put a note on it in handwriting to say that this doesn't go far enough, make it worse, and then there's no consequences. And the whole time that they're banning people, just to add quickly, they're also talking about democracy and plurality of views. Again, with the straight face, it's really astounding. But there's just one more thing I feel the need to mention in this particular context. Now, there's lots of debate about the extent of influence, but it's very well documented that Western powers have armed lots of far-right and frankly neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, Azov, Ida, C14, and even some really extreme groups such as Kraken. Now, I always think it's just worth mentioning here that it's striking that so many Western outlets have, since 2014, documented the extent and influence of these far-right groups and neo-Nazi groups. Yet now, if you mention them, it's called Russian disinformation. And it means, by their own logic, BBC, New York Times, etc., have themselves engaged in Russian disinformation. It's just one of those strange things that is worthy of observation, I think, that with the sort of norms of reality have been so far distorted. Now, just looking at the time, we have got a few more questions here. There's one on Taiwan, one on the EU, and then there was one very short one that I was just going to add at the end. So one of them is, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, there were demonstrations of Taiwanese outside the hotel protesting her visit. Taiwan is being used by the US to create a potential war situation. What do we know about how the Taiwanese people view this? It might be quite a specific question, but if you can shed any light, go for it. The other one is, what will the long-term effects of the conflict be on the EU? For example, Germany seems to be slowly moving closer to Russia and France to a lesser extent. Maybe that might be a bit more within the realms of expertise, but feel free to give either a go. And we'll go with Fiona first, if that's okay, and then over to Andrew.
Sorry, Sequoia, can you just repeat both of them quickly? I was messaging in the chat at the same time, I'm afraid, so I missed some of it.
Oh, no problem. Yep. First one is in relation to Taiwan. When Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, there was demonstrations of Taiwanese outside the hotel protesting a visit. Taiwan is being used by the US to create a potential war situation. What do we know about how the Taiwanese people view this? I understand it's quite a specific question, but if you've got any particular insight. And then the other one was, what are the long-term effects of the conflict be on the EU? This presumably refers to Ukraine. For example, Germany seems to be moving slowly closer to Russia and France to a lesser extent. So, any?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, Taiwan is part of China. The United States is being extremely provocative. I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi's visit, it was received very badly in China and throughout Asia, and I think it's a very deliberate provocation. It's an attempt to go over China's red line. So, you know, and I think it is comparable to the process of what's been taking place with the United States and NATO and Russia. So I think it's extremely provocative and dangerous. So just, yeah, that's maybe I would like to emphasize really on Taiwan. And there has been recent elections where the current pro-US party has had massive losses. And then what was the second question again, Sequoia? Was about the EU. And yeah, I mean, I think this is I think the struggle that's taking place in the world is not something that's going to be, you know, define the next few years. I think this is a long-term fight that the United States is waging, basically to defend the current, well, the world order it wants, which is the United States domination. So I think, you know, there's a huge struggle to be had within Europe about whether or not you're going to go down that very dangerous path, which could result in nuclear war and potentially destroy the whole planet, or whether you're going to have an independent foreign policy from the United States. And there are forces in Europe, that want to do that, but we're in a very small minority, I think, at the moment. I think the changes that have taken place in German foreign policy this year have been quite substantial. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of pushing back against that US that US agenda. But I think the US is absolutely determined to keep pushing that forward. So we shouldn't be under any illusions about how difficult that fight's going to be.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. Just looking at the time, I know it's getting quite late for everyone, but if we could just pick up on, there was a question from John. South London is amongst the most international, multinational places in the world. High streets in Lewisham, Woolwich, etc. have a lot of people from various backgrounds. How can No Cold War and the peace movement better incorporate potential allies from non-NATO countries living in London? And I'll also just add this one, and it'll be the last question we go with, to both of you. What books, films, and documentaries would you recommend to further one's knowledge in these all related areas? So we will go with Andrew and then to Fiona, please.
So I'm going to leave the specific organizational and political question to Fiona about the organization. Just to say, I mean, I believe that any of these struggles are also struggles against racism and discrimination of various types. And I think I agree entirely that the diversity of London is a massive strength, and that anti-war activities, pro-peace activities are struggles that have to embrace also communities who suffer extraordinary discrimination, racism, and often huge material difficulties at home as well. Oh my gosh, in terms of books, films, documentaries, there are too many for me to...
Any standout?
But yeah, there is one... There is a point, yeah. There is a book by, for those of you who have seen The Shadow World, it's a slightly unconventional documentary in the sense that threaded through the film, which was made by a Belgian director and visual artist, is the prose of an extraordinary Uruguayan writer who sadly died just as we were finishing the film, and to whom the film is dedicated, Eduardo Galeano. Galeano wrote a book called The Open Veins of Latin America about the impacts of colonialism on Latin America, which Hugo Chavez handed a copy to Barack Obama at the United Nations, which caused quite a sensation. But the book that I would recommend, and I wish a film had been made of it because it is needed, is another book by Galeano called Children of the Days, which isn't particularly well known. It is a book divided into 365 chapters, one for every day of the year. And in his quite exquisite prose, Galeano narrates, sometimes in a few sentences, sometimes in a few pages, an event from human history, some quite recent, some from thousands of years ago, that either played an extraordinary role in progressing the struggle for justice, for equality, for peace, or played an important role in undermining that same struggle. And I have to confess, and I know this sounds very cliched, but it is the one book that I actually do keep next to my bed. And I'm not a particularly dictatorial parent, but I did insist that both of my children, before they finished school, which they did a few years ago now, that they had both read the book, because it has had such an extraordinary impact on my life and my thinking. The second thing I just want to say, and I can't think of a specific documentary that maybe covers this, because there are so many brilliant documentaries out there at the moment. The one that I've watched recently that really struck me is The End of Democracy, about the use of a so-called anti-corruption campaign to jail Lula and to remove him from the political process, which gloriously now has ultimately failed. But it is quite terrifying to see how the forces of reaction will use something like perceived corruption by people who are far more corrupt than those they're accusing of corruption to achieve certain political ends. But I think that the one last message I'd like to leave people with is that, you know, all of these conflicts are complex, and we mustn't be afraid of the nuance and the complexity. For instance, you know, Vladimir Putin is no great supporter of press freedom. I'm not sure that is any worse than our own governments and the self-censorship of our own media in many ways, but he has also been responsible directly or indirectly for the deaths of a number of very good and important investigative journalists, including 2 people I actually worked with. And I don't think we should shy away from these nuances and complexities of the situations we find ourselves in. We should embrace them. We should not stop talking about the neo-Nazis that have been integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces. We should not stop talking about the fact that President Zelensky came up in the Pandora Papers as having $1.4 billion in offshore jurisdictions. But we should also accept that this isn't a Manichean world in which there is pure good and pure evil. Unfortunately, no such thing exists. And I think, if anything, Eduardo Galeano's book brought that home to me in both a historical and a current sense that I'm extraordinarily grateful for.
Just before I bring in Fiona, I have to 1,000% endorse. I've got it open based on Latin America from behind me just now. And there's another one called Book of Embraces that I recommend. Basically, I'm sure Andrew agrees with this. Anything by Eduardo Galeano, including his collection of essays and articles. If you haven't read him, the closest example I can give you, if you've come across Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he's kind of like the political journalistic version of that. So he brings poetry, prose, and almost semi-magical realism, without going too tangential here, into the political and cultural realm to brilliant and I would say moving effect. There's not really anyone quite like him. So yeah, I just wanted to strongly endorse that. Fiona?
Yeah, and do people remember when Chavez gave Open Veins in Latin America to Obama as a gift? That was classic Chavez. I mean, yeah, I think the recommendations we made are great. I mean, I would add, it's been put in the chat actually, that I think Oliver Stone's documentary on Ukraine is just phenomenal. It's completely down the line. That's why they keep on trying to remove it from the internet. So I would definitely try and catch that. I don't know where you can get it at the moment. I mean, in terms of other books, just a bit of a plug for No Cold War. We joined forces with the Monthly Review and Tricontinental to produce a book called The US is Waging a Cold War, A Socialist Perspective. And yes, it's definitely a very, very good book. It contains a number of essays. It is quite terrifying, the kind of this discussion I was mentioning before about what's happening in the United States establishment about, you know, potential of hot wars. So definitely brace yourself before you read it, but it's really excellent. And there's another book, just because some of the issues around what are the dynamics in Asia has been raised. It's a few years old, but there's a book by Jude Woodward called The US versus China, Asia's New Cold War. And you know, that gives you a very good overview of the situation in Asia, which you know, there'll be a lot of information that isn't very common knowledge over here. So I would really recommend that book as well. And then so just moving on to the final thing about how do we engage diverse communities in South London. I mean, I think I just love the question to begin with, and I think the fact that that's being asked is the main thing. And if at 9 o'clock at night I've got a coherent answer to that, I'll be delighted. But I mean, just as a sort of initial start to that, I think fortunately we're in an international alliance. No Cold War is an international alliance, and we're the British branch, and so we have links all over the world, and that means with the help of Zoom, we can get speakers from all over the world to speak. So I think it's very important to take advantage of that and have Global South speakers at our events. I think that might attract a different audience, and it's not necessarily the usual suspects. And you know, that perspective against, you know, US's threats to the whole of humanity is a much more mainstream view in other parts of the world. And I think just one of the issues, I mean, obviously there's the issue of linking this question, which we've done tonight really, with the topic of NATO war makes us poor, but just how this Cold War interrelates with the struggles that people are facing every day in terms of the cost of living crisis, I think is important. And the other struggle, which is very live at the moment, is the increase in racism that we're seeing from the Cold War as a direct consequence, targeting people of Chinese heritage, but anyone of Asian heritage, really. I mean, races don't distinguish. So I think that is a very important live struggle. And I think there'll be people who, from the Chinese community, we can link up with already in the leadership of No Cold War Britain. We have a number of people, leading activists from the Chinese community. But I think it'd be very important to link up with other communities and have some solidarity with that, because I think that really has to go up the agenda of the Labour movement, the left, and the anti-racist movement, because I think the increase in hate crime has been horrendous, and it's just not given enough priority, in my opinion. So I think, you know, that's a really key, that's been a really key element in the movement against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the racism and Islamophobia that produced. We're seeing something not on the same scale, but something, you know, very horrible happening on this. So I think that would be a good thing to sort of start the discussion about how we engage diverse communities in the campaign.
Thanks so much, Fiona. I'll just sort of add that I'm always struck by, when it comes to our coverage of countries around the world, we only ever interview people from those countries that align with certain Western views. And I've got a friend who went to Nicaragua to speak to some people in a fairly remote village, and he spoke to this 80-year-old woman, and he just said, "Oh, what do you think of the Sandinistas in Ortega?" And she said, and this is something I think people in the West struggle to be able to relate to, this type of phrasing, because often Ho Chi Minh was described in this way, Fidel Castro was described in this way, Chavez as well. She said, I don't care about any of the ridiculous lies and propaganda. He gave us things, he gave us infrastructure, he gave us water, schools, education. He's like a father to me. And I just think you never hear that kind of thing. So I think it will be important, and it's a task for all of us to try and make those voices, both within the context of Britain and more broadly, heard. And hopefully we can use this, these groups as a platform for those voices. So I'm just very conscious of time. I've just put in the social media channels again. So give us a follow. And I think Fiona had put in her email address in the chat. So if you want to be added to the mailing list, you can send her an email, or you can, if you haven't already, just put your name and that you're willing to consent for us to use it for further correspondence. Again, also just to mention that the video and event will be uploaded onto the YouTube channel. So if there's anything, any points or anything that you wanted to pick up on from any of the contributions, or just want to listen to or watch again, feel free. I've found, just as a little tip, one nice thing, if you can't necessarily take the time to watch an event, it's always good to be able to listen, and you can multitask. Thank you again to all the speakers, organisers, and of course our wonderfully engaged audience. As mentioned earlier, we've got lots of plans for the future, so we hope to see you all very soon. Thank you all again, and have a good evening. Take care all. Oh, and buy Andrew Feinstein's book.